Good evening all, and welcome. Happy Christmas to each and every one of you. Now today's video is going to be just a little bit different. Many of you in the past have requested that my wife narrate some stories, so as a little Christmas gift to all of those curious, she has gone ahead and narrated half. So you're in for a treat. I hope you're ready, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm a coordinator for a local non-profit grassroots organization in the city of Denver. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but all it really means is that I work with at-risk youths in shelters and high schools. Basically, mentoring in after-school programs, summer camps, workshops and the like. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and I have loved every minute of it, because I've had the privilege of working with dozens of amazing kids. Some of them just need a little guidance and a safe place to hang out after school. Then there are some that do need a lot of love and patience, because they've been deeply scarred. I love my kids as if they were my own, and most of them do consider me to be like a second mother. There is one student of mine that will always stand out in my heart, Landon. This story is about him. You know how there are some people that just by looking at them, you know they'll be special. They have such genuine souls and see the world in such a beautiful way. It's like they're angels among us, put here to protect and inspire. Well, that was Landon. Unfortunately, Landon grew up in a broken home in a bad neighborhood. He had a history of depression and of being a runaway, which is how I met him at the shelter. Landon also had an 8-year-old brother named Jeremy, who he took care of because their parents were neglectful pieces of crap. The point is, Landon never let his trauma keep him from seeing the best in people and wanting to make a difference in his community. He quickly became a part of our family at the shelter and one of our best volunteers, even receiving an award from the city for his community service. I knew that with a loving environment, Landon had the potential and talent to do great things. But one day towards the end of the summer, Landon didn't show up for workshop. A few days later, he didn't show up for our Friday meeting. Days went by, and there was no sign of him. We tried contacting him, and we even went as a group to check on him at his mother's house, but there was no answer. In the end, it was like he vanished. I tried my best to pretend I was okay. After all, I had my own other kids to worry about. Admittedly, however, I was devastated inside and a little heartbroken. I knew he had a history of running away, but I didn't think he would leave his shelter family without at least leaving a note. Over time, I managed to put it behind me and prayed he was safe wherever he was. Fast forward to Christmas Eve of 2016, and I was throwing a party at my house, the same one I throw every year, where I invite all of my students, family, and friends to celebrate. That night, I had not been my usual cheerful self, because I had Landon on my mind. I tried not thinking about it, but every time my front door swung open, a part of me was hoping it was Landon coming home for Christmas. It sounds cheesy, I know, but I think it's something only mothers can understand. We just want all of our kids to be together on Christmas. The party had gone great, and I think it was around 11 PM when the last of my guests were climbing in their cars and pulling out of my driveway. All of my guests had left earlier because of a stupid snowstorm warning reported for my area, and they did not want to get snowed in. I looked out the window, and indeed, the streets were already covered in a thick blanket of snow that was getting heavier by the hour. I sighed, and after a while of staring out into the snowy scenery, I decided to go back to washing the last of the dishes left in the sink. My husband was already upstairs in our room, asleep, and my son, who was back home from college, was in his room asleep as well. Needless to say, the house was completely quiet. In the middle of washing, I began to hear a light tapping coming from the living room. I ignored it at first, but it got louder, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. Slowly, I tiptoed into the living room, only to find nothing and hear nothing. Just as suddenly as the tapping had started, it stopped. I was a little weirded out, but I was too tired to investigate any further. So I just shrugged it off, thinking it was the wind from outside playing tricks on me. I went back about my business in the kitchen, finally getting all of the dishes done and the leftovers put away. As I was about to switch off the light and head upstairs, I heard a knock at my front door. I froze at the bottom of the steps. My initial thought was that it could have been my daughter that had come home early from her boyfriend's house, but I knew that she had a key, and she would have called me beforehand to open the door for her, in the case that she had left it. I stood there on the bottom step for what seemed like a few minutes, debating if I should ignore whoever was outside or not. So I decided to peek through the window next to the door. The heavy snowfall and fog accumulated on the glass and made it hard for me to get a clear look, but I could definitely see the silhouette of a person standing on my porch. I didn't know what to do, and was seriously considering waking up my husband. That's when I heard a voice from the other side calling my name. I immediately unlocked the door, and there was Landon. My motherly instincts kicked in. I quickly brought him out the cold, sat him down in my kitchen and fixed him a plate of the party leftovers out the fridge. Looking back now, I guess I was so happy to see him that I didn't notice that he hardly spoke. He would just warmly smile and nod, and give me short answers like yes and no. I did ask him where he'd been all this time, and why he hadn't called. He paused for a moment, and then gently placed his hand over mine. He said, "I missed you." I should have known then by how cold his hands were. The microwave beeped. I served him his plate overflowing with food, and sat down with him, catching him up on all he'd missed at the shelter while he was gone. He hardly ate, but when he finished he walked over to the sink to wash the plate. Typical Landon. I stopped him, of course, and insisted that he was my guest, and he needn't worry about it. He then thanked me, and announced that his ride was there, and he had to go see Jeremy. I declined, and essentially told him he was crazy if he thought I was going to let him leave in the middle of a snowstorm on Christmas. I told him he was more than welcome to spend the night, and then in the morning, I would personally take him to see Jeremy. When I said that, he looked at me, and then the floor, and I could tell something was troubling him. Before I could ask what was wrong, he said okay, and walked over to the couch in the living room. I got him some blankets from the closet, and as I handed them to him, again, he looked at me, and then at the floor, and quietly said, "I miss you." The way he said it that time was so distant, like if he were miles away and not just standing there in my living room. I hugged him tightly and told him that I had missed him too, that I had prayed for him every night. After that, he turned around to lay on the couch to go to sleep, or so I thought. I stood there for a moment, grateful that he was back with us. When I got up early the next morning, he was already gone. He waited for me to go to sleep and walked out in the middle of the night. Typical Landon. This time, he did leave a note that simply read, "Take care of Jeremy." It wasn't until a few weeks later, when Jeremy was brought into the shelter by a police officer, that I finally learned the truth about Landon. He had decided to end his own life. At first, I couldn't believe it, until I saw Landon's headstone for myself. I must have stared at that stone for what felt like hours, with tears in my eyes and in complete disbelief. It read that Landon had passed away in August. This story is dedicated to all of those genuine but lost souls out there. And don't worry, my friend, I promise to take care of Jeremy.
This didn't happen to me, but my brother. Last Christmas, my two brothers came over as they do every year and started drinking with my parents. All of us couldn't help but notice that one of my brothers was drinking heavier than usual. After the drunk brother went to bed, my other brother explained the reason behind his heavy drinking. He was training to be a park ranger. He wasn't even a full ranger yet and was called out to help search for a missing older couple after a storm blew through and had wrecked a nearby neighborhood. When my brother came back to the couple's home, or should I say, what was left of their home, he noticed two bodies lying side by side in their bed. My brother, not fully equipped to see such gruesome things, ran to see them without thinking. He saw the couple with their heads crushed in from a fallen bit of their roof. He said that my brother had described it like seeing two crushed grapes.
For some background, about 2 weeks ago, I got the horrible news that my little brother John had unexpectedly died. I immediately flew to my parents' home with my twin brother Adam and his girlfriend, who live in the same city as me. This incident occurred around 7 AM Christmas morning, 7 days after John's death. I was laying on my side on the couch, with my eyes closed. I was awake, but didn't want to get up yet, since my family friend Tammy was sleeping on an air mattress in the same room as me, and I didn't want to wake her. Suddenly, I felt someone poke me hard in the back. Confused and slightly annoyed, I looked around and saw that Tammy was still across the room in bed. I then looked to the kitchen. My parents have an open floor plan, so the living room and kitchen are connected, and I saw my brother Adam walking towards his bedroom. Thinking he had gotten me up to talk about something, I followed him. As I followed him, he went into the bathroom instead of his bedroom. I thought this was odd, since he just came and got me. When he came out, he looked surprised to see me, and asked what I was doing. I said, "You just got me up." Looking confused, he said, "No, I didn't. I came into the kitchen for coffee, but realized I had to go to the bathroom first." As we argued back and forth, me saying how he poked me, and him insisting he didn't, Tammy woke up and asked if everything was okay. I started explaining what was going on, but she interrupted me and asked, "You weren't just crying?" "No." "You should go check on your mum. She's sobbing. She sounds really upset." so concerned, I walked into my parents' room to find them both asleep. Now, Tammy insists that she heard someone hysterically crying, and I know what I felt was a poke, and not just some muscle spasm. I know that grief can cause hallucinations, but I do find it odd that we both experienced something unexplainable within a matter of minutes. Do you guys think this was a grief-induced incident? Or do you think something more might have happened? I did some research and found very little about grief-induced tactile hallucinations. That, plus the fact that this was a shared experience, has me questioning. I'm really not sure what to think.
Last Christmas, I was over at my fiance's place. The two of us were doing homework and just sort of hanging out. During a lull in the conversation, I heard what I thought sounded like tyres screeching on the pavement. It was very far away, and given that downtown was nearby and I'm partially deaf, I shouldn't have been able to hear it. I didn't mention the sound because my fiance didn't seem bothered, so I brushed it off as sound travelling in the city. 5 minutes later, it happens again, but closer this time. She looked over at me and her eyebrow raised. Again, downtown is close and we brushed it off as noise coming from there. The next time was about 5 blocks away. It happened 30 seconds after the other, which is way too fast for anybody to travel from downtown to where we were. We both noticed something this time. 1, the pitch was changing constantly, so it couldn't be a recording. 2, it wasn't a screech of tyres, but an undescribable, inhumane scream. We looked at each other and laughed sort of half-heartedly, while trying to still make light of our situation, only to be cut off. Whatever was screaming had gotten to the end of our street in 10 seconds. We both jumped into action, started locking windows and doors, and were halfway down the hall to her room when the 5th and final wail sounded. I shit you not, this thing must have been at the apartment steps. We bolted into her room and she ripped an older book off her shelf. I've never seen someone skim through pages so fast. Next thing I know, we're taking protective measures and actively trying not to think about what just happened. A few hours later, with us not making a sound during that time, her mother comes home and we race to tell her our story. It takes her about 10 minutes before she looked us both in the eyes and say, "Sounds like a banshee." I don't know what it was or what happened to it, but that is hands down the spookiest thing that I have ever experienced to this day.
Christmas morning, 2004. The police station received an odd call from another station 600 kilometers away, saying that a young man in his late teens had handed himself over to them, claiming that he had shot his grandmother that night and drove all the way to the coast, Johannesburg, to Durban. I was the detective on call that day, and since there was no immediate police van in the area, me and my partner had to go check it out. When we got to the address, we found a locked house with no answer. Knowing it might have been a prank call, I started walking around the house looking for an open window or some kind of evidence to support the call, not wanting to blindly break down a door based on a phone call alone. So, I managed to pry open a bedroom window, and what I saw inside still gives me chills to this day. It happened to be the master bedroom, and there inside, looking right up at me, was a bloodied face with big, bewildering eyes. We broke down the door and found the lady in her bed, still alive, She had been shot in the head the day before by her grandson who was living with her, and somehow managed to not die, and instead just lie there helpless, her bedroom TV blaring in a foreign language, as she was a French immigrant. The whole house reeked due to her soiling herself, and while waiting for the ambulance to arrive, I used some of her perfume spray in the room so that I could conduct my investigation. But that just made it worse. The smell of shit and perfume fused to form a smell that I would never forget. It was a common perfume, and from that day, it's hard to be around anyone wearing it. It would trigger the accompanying shit smell, which in turn would conjure those eyes pleading for help through the bedroom window. She died later that week in hospital, and the grandson was charged with murder. He had shot her with a .22, stolen the neighbour's car, and made his way to Durban. On his way there, he was being overcome with guilt and decided to hand himself over. Boy, did I have an interesting story to tell the family at Christmas dinner.
This happened to my dad. When he was a kid, he got a CB radio for Christmas. Now, living in a farm, this was both a toy and a tool. He could talk to my grandpa or others and tell them something important, and he could talk to the neighbourhood kids. Well, one day, him and his friends got the great idea to add a large antenna and use a booster to get the signal of this low-powered CB to reach the nearby interstate truck traffic. Then one day, they got in the radio and said, "All truckers get off the interstate at exit blah 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 and go around. They are pulling trucks over." So pretty soon, truckers started getting off the interstate, but also they soon realised the truth. My dad said one trucker claimed he knew where they lived and they were coming for these kids. My dad said him and his friends were so scared they smashed the CB and hid it away for the rest of the day, convinced they were going to get killed by angry truckers.
In the fall of 1982, my mother married a man who ultimately became my stepfather. I was a 5-year-old girl at the time, and an only child, so the three of us quickly settled into a small house and became an instant family. Just add water. Being that my mother hadn't known this man for too long, there were things about him that she hadn't had the chance to learn, like that he had been discharged from the military for drug abuse. He had spent some time in a mental institution, and, oh yes, the tiny matter of him suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. In all fairness, so long as he took his meds, life was fairly normal. However, a few days after they married, my parents began attending a Pentecostal church, and around 1989, after being called to the altar during one of the many revivals hosted by our church, my stepfather was delivered of his medications and cured of his schizophrenia, or so said the pastor. Nearly a year passed with no meds being taken, and life was fine. My stepfather functioned normally, going to work with no issues. But our normalcy wasn't to last. The incidences started small and were barely noticeable at first. For instance, when we would leave the house to go grocery shopping or go to church, my stepfather would have to check and make sure that the door was locked multiple times. He would stand there with the key and lock it. Then he would jiggle the knob just to be sure. Sometimes, he would make it to the car before turning back around to check once more. Once or twice, we made it a few miles down the road, when he would just turn the car around to check the door was locked one final time. It quickly escalated from the door locks to him thinking that there were people after him. He would walk our property line every night with a gun and flashlight to make sure that no one was lurking. It needs to be mentioned that we lived virtually in the middle of nowhere, with one road in and one road out. If a person was lurking, they would have to hike through many miles of forest to get to us. When the all-nighters started, that's when I became frightened. My stepfather would sit in his recliner with his rifle at the ready all night long. He would just sit in the dark and smoke one cigarette after another as the hours ticked by. I would lay awake in my bedroom and listen to his lighter flare to life over and over again. Some nights I would have to use the restroom so badly, but I would be terrified to leave my room for fear of being shot. The few times I simply could not hold it in any longer, I tried to be as quiet as possible, even going so far as to hold my breath and tiptoeing past the entrance of the living room, where he sat in complete darkness, only the cherry of his cigarette visible. It was around that time that he left his current job as a construction worker, because he felt that members of his crew were plotting against him, and became a farmhand. The new job was somewhat of a relief to him, as no one but the cows could scheme and plot now. However, it also meant a serious cut in his wages. We struggled for many months, barely paying the bills or eating when my mother decided she would have to get a job. Her first attempt at working was as a newspaper delivery woman, and it ended after the first day with an explosive argument over him accusing her of cheating with all of her customers. There were dishes thrown and a fist put through the hallway closet door before she gave the job up. She was soon offered a job working with her sister, answering phones for a local clubhouse. My stepfather decided that her sister was safe enough and allowed this. My mother had only been working outside the home for about 2 weeks when things turned very bad very fast. My mother working meant I would be home alone with my stepfather for a few hours every day after school. At first, we both just kept to ourselves in an uncomfortable sort of unspoken arrangement. But that would soon change when he started exposing himself to me. I was 14 years old the first time. I was in the kitchen making an after-school snack before scuttling into my bedroom to hide for the evening, when I heard him go into the bathroom. No big deal, and it gave me the time to get from the kitchen to my room without seeing him. But unfortunately, no. It wasn't my lucky day after all. Just as I was passing the bathroom door, he swung it open violently, causing me to jump and look to see what was up. What I saw was his penis. There he stood, with his trousers hanging just low enough that everything was exposed, and with a full erection. I became instantly sick, and ran the rest of the way to my room, where I closed and locked the door. I couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been waiting for me to pass, and had timed it perfectly. I lay in my bed and cried, sick with worry and fear of what would happen next. The sound of my mother coming home was music to my ears, though I couldn't bring myself to tell her. I was terrified that it would somehow be my fault, so I said nothing. A week or so later, I was home alone after school working on a project on the dining room table, when I heard him pull into the driveway. I quickly grabbed as much of my stuff as I could and ran to my room, locking myself inside. I heard him enter the house, and go straight to the bathroom and begin to shower. I gradually relaxed a little and got on with my schoolwork, until he called me to come and clear the dining room table to get the rest of my stuff. I was going over in my mind what remained, and how long it would take me to collect it all. It wouldn't be a few seconds, but one trip shouldn't be an issue. I was wrong. As I entered the dining room table, he was in there standing next to it, looking over my belongings. He said nothing, so I quickly started lifting the few items that remained without looking over to him. He made a move like he was going to pass me and leave, but instead, he very quickly slid up next to me and pressed his body onto mine. I could feel he, again, had an erection. He spoke in a voice I could hardly recognize as he was pressing hard against me and said, "I can help you if you like. Do you want me to help?" I squeezed my eyes closed and somehow plucked up the courage to squeak out, "No," before pushing past him and rushing to my bedroom and locking the door. Again, I never told my mother. I guess I felt like she suffered enough with his illness that I would spare her this. I started keeping a kitchen knife under my pillow in case he ever made it into my room. Every day, I would go to school and act as if life were perfect. So much so that my friends said many times they wished they had my home life. I deserved an Emmy. One afternoon, he finally went too far though. My mother and I were sitting on the sofa, and he was on his chair. I was spending a few moments with her, as I rarely saw her anymore, and the phone rang, and she got up and went to the kitchen to go and answer it. It was at this time that cordless phones were still for rich people, so I stood there to leave too, as I didn't want to stay in there alone with him, when he told me to sit and watch the game. He said something like I was growing up so fast and would soon be gone. Trying to avoid conflict, I sat back down on the sofa and tried to watch the football game he had on. I noticed movement from the corner of my eye and glanced over towards him. What I saw horrified me. There he sat, with his junk hanging out of the leg of his shorts, stroking it. I felt I would vomit. I quickly made my way into the kitchen and over to the notepad we kept on the phone. I scribbled a message from my mother that simply said for her to go look at Dad. She was confused and asked me what I meant. I pleaded with her to please go look before running into my bedroom. I sat on my bed, sick with nerves, as I heard the chair she was sitting in slide away from the table. The next thing I heard was my mother explode. She screamed in a voice I had never heard, before demanding that he tell her what the hell he was doing. I heard him jump up from the chair and start yelling at her that he had no idea what she was talking about. There was things being thrown and more screaming before my mother came to the door. She took me by the arm and led me out to the car. She told me that we were leaving and that she was done with him. Relief flooded through me, and I began to cry tears of joy as she reversed from the driveway and into the road. It was then that my stepfather ran from the house and stood in front of the car. He was begging my mother to stay, insisting he had no idea what she had been talking about. She turned to look at me and then gunned it. The front bumper cracked off his knee, sending him to the ground yelling in pain. Neither of us spoke as she drove. I had no idea where she was going, and I didn't care as long as it was away from him. We ended up at my aunt's house as we had nowhere else to go. We weren't there for long when he showed up, and I begged my mother to not go out and talk to him. But of course, she did. After a few minutes, He had convinced her that he was innocent, and I found myself right back in my house of horrors. Things were fairly quiet for a few weeks. I stayed away from him, he stayed away from me. Apart from a few incidences where he pretended to be doing something outside my bedroom door, mumbling, as to where I would hear him say things like, I had to destroy their relationship but failed. Just nonsense. Mother revealed to me that during this time, things in their intimate life were getting extremely weird. He wanted to have a baby with her, and after no luck conceiving, he began to try new things, like rubbing semen all over his body in an attempt to increase fertility. Of course, I was blamed for them being unable to have a baby. He told me I had wrecked my mother's insides. Whatever the reason, I'm thankful they didn't get pregnant. So now it's Christmas time, and things are beginning to deteriorate once more. He had started sitting up all night again, as he just knew that my then boyfriend was out to kill him. I feel I should say that my boyfriend was a 15-year-old kid that didn't drive and lived half an hour away on the other side of the county. So yeah, he wasn't doing anything. Things had gotten so bad that my stepfather was now seeing demons. He would stand at the back window and talk to something no one else could see. Mother was forced to quit her job so that he could keep an eye on her, meaning he would come home from work early, trying to catch her cheating. It was now Christmas Eve, 1992. Money was very tight, and an argument ensued over presents that had appeared under the tree. My stepfather had accused my mother of prostituting herself to pay for the gifts, which of course triggered an argument of epic proportions. She stood to leave when he grabbed her and threw her on the couch. He then retrieved a rifle from behind his recliner and pointed it at her. I ran to the room yelling at him to stop. I wasn't very big, but I was mad as hell and had enough. I jumped onto his back to try and wrestle him, but failed miserably. He slung me onto the floor like a rag doll and then turned the rifle on me. I was told to lift a 5-gallon bucket he had sitting there and turn it over and place it next to the Christmas tree. I was then told to sit on it while my mother was told to stay on the couch. My stepfather held us at gunpoint on Christmas Eve for over 13 hours. Neither of us were allowed to get up and go to the bathroom, or for any purpose at all. We weren't allowed to speak or even look at each other for too long. He talked of life before us. He talked about how he would get rid of us, but mostly there was mind-numbing silence. Once it seemed he figured out how he would end all this, my mother shot me a look that told me it was now or never. Though not a word was spoken, I knew what was to happen. In a very courageous move, she stood from the couch and started walking towards him. He of course jumped up and shouted at her to sit back down, but she continued forward. She approached him, saying that she wanted to have a baby with him, and that she could feel tonight was the night it was going to happen. He listened to her as she crossed the floor. Once she reached him, she asked him if he could give her a baby. As soon as he relaxed his demeanor a little, she grabbed the rifle and they began to fight. I have never been so scared in all my life. I jumped up and grabbed the phone before running out. Thank God we had very recently graduated to a cordless phone. I ducked behind my mother's car and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly, I barely managed to push the buttons. I told the operator what was happening, and though she told me to stay on the line, I hung up and called my stepfather's parents. They were all too familiar with his episodes and managed to get to us before the police did. though they were only from across town. God love his mother, a retired Navy veteran. She all but kicked in the door and took him down. All I heard was him scream, "Mama!" Shortly after, the police arrived along with an ambulance. To my horror, a boy I went to school with rode volunteer with the rescue squad, and of course he recognized me. After my stepfather was subdued and handcuffed, and over 21 guns removed from our home, and all the madness quieted, this schoolmate of mine approached me. I am now 41, and will never forget the words he said to me. He took my hand in his, looked me in the eyes and simply said, "No one will know." I'm still tearing up thinking about it. He indeed kept his word and told no one. I went back to school after Christmas break and continued on earning my Emmy. My stepfather was put back on his meds and had to see a few doctors. And yes, for those of you dying to know, my mother stayed with him. I left the house permanently a little bit later. There had been no further incidences, but our relationship was too strained for me to stay any longer. As an adult, I understand entirely his mental illness and have in fact forgiven him. He passed away in 2014, and while a part of me was a little relieved, I still mourn his loss, as he was the only father I ever knew.
I was 9 and lived close by a busy road. It was December 24th and we were having dinner with my family. We heard a terrible accident. As we got out, we see the car hit the light post and there is no driver and no one else to be seen besides the curious people that are leaving their houses to see what is going on. Someone is calling the police. Some people are going around the block looking for the driver and possible victims. Someone got inside the car to look for documents and insurance and decided to pop open the trunk. People scream and start to run away. As I look, the car owner was in the trunk, with a bullet in his forehead, with his arms and legs tied up together. The police arrived shortly after and cleared the area. It was very awkward to go back to the house to finish dinner. Another one was that when I was almost 11, I got up in the middle of the night to have some water and I found my stepdad on the kitchen floor passed out. I woke up my mother to take him to bed. I am ordered to go back to sleep. When I wake up the next morning to go to school, and I am not allowed to go downstairs, I had been stopped by one of the paramedics. My stepdad had had a heart attack, and I was the one who found him dead.
I've been in the police for nearly 2 years now. I was working a late shift on Christmas Eve, which is usually a matter of holding the fort and counting down the clock until the end of the shift. We get a call. Sudden death. An elderly gentleman. A shame, certainly, but nothing more than assumed routine. Inspecting the body for signs of trauma and calling the undertakers to remove the deceased. We get there and go in. The gentleman is lying on his sofa, with a duvet covering him. I perform the usual inspection of the house, looking for anything out of place or suspicious. Not that it would be easy. The house was like your over-the-top hoarder's palace. After some inquiries, it became apparent that the gentleman had lost the use of his legs many years before and lived downstairs, relying on his daughter to take care of him, utterly. We have to inspect the body for any signs of trauma or suspicious marks prior to calling the undertaker, so that we are sure that there is nothing untowards in relation to the death. We lifted off the duvet, as only his head was showing, and I was rather taken aback and stunned. The main images, having studied history at university, that came to mind was the pictures from the liberation of the concentration camps, emaciated and starved corpses. This man had been dead for no more than 4 or 5 hours, yet he was all skin and bones. He relied on his own daughter to care for him, and he clearly had not been. He lay there in his own filth, wasting away without anyone properly looking after him. It was utterly despicable. Death has a very distinct smell. It clings to your uniform and your body. I finished my shift in the early hours of the morning, went home and tried to sleep. I couldn't. I just lay there, eyes wide open. The man's body and his haunting stare taking centerpiece in my thoughts. In the end, I thought, screw it. I'm not going to sleep at this rate. I got into my car and drove the 100 miles to my parents' house to spend Christmas Day with them. To end on a slightly more humorous note, while opening one of the doors in the house, a cat jumped out the darkness at me, and I absolutely shit myself. I nearly tumbled down the stairs with a shrill yelp. Anyway, it was a decent Christmas after that ordeal.
It was early Christmas morning a couple of years ago. Before the sun rose, I received several reports of shots fired in a quiet neighbourhood. When I got to the neighbourhood, the local residents directed me to a house with an open door. I went into the house, at the far rear room, and found 2 bodies with JSW to the head, lying on top of each other, tangled up and lodged between the bed and nightstand. I recovered a single pistol and would find out it was a murder-suicide. The scene was processed. We were all packing up to leave when the eldest daughter pulls up. She is somehow related to someone in the ME's office and got word of what happened. The lead investigator has me stay with him while he informs the daughter of what happens. By this time it's dawn, approximately 8 a.m. During the debrief, smack in the middle, the eldest daughter calls the younger teenage siblings and tells them what happened. All on speakerphone. I literally heard the teen answer the phone with joy and excitement and suddenly switch to her breaking down in disbelief when she learned her father had killed her mother. The older daughter would later tell us that her father was unstable and she was going to come by the previous night to drop food for preparation of Christmas Day. She was so upset with herself because she was too tired to do so. She felt as though if she had done something differently or had changed the order of things, she would at least have been able to see her mother for one more day. After we finally cleared the scene, it was about 10 a.m. I drove home on a literal empty highway alone with my thoughts. I made it home where all of my family, my mother, father, sister, brother, nieces, nephews, had all started opening gifts. It was really one of the biggest Christmases we have ever had, and I just didn't have the spirit for it. If you have family that you love and cherish, make sure you do so every opportunity that you have, because one more day is never guaranteed.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video and my wife's performance. She said that she had a lot of fun recording them. Please do be sure to drop a like if you enjoyed the video and let us both know what you thought in the comments section below. Some subscribers that sent their stories actually sent them in around, well, just after Christmas last year. So they've had to wait patiently just to hear their stories. So if you're listening now, I hope that you enjoyed it and that it was worth the wait. Thank you so much for submitting your stories again. If there is a story that you wish to share, feel free to send it to my email or drop it into my Reddit. Either are fine. Just please be sure to include plenty of description, punctuation and paragraphing, as these are the key 3 things I look for when narrating a story. I hope that you have all had a very wonderful and festive time, and not experienced a horrific Christmas like in these stories. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome,